My son doesn't know this, but I secretly heard him tell another man, "I wish that useless old man wasn't my father. I wish you were my dad instead." So I made his wish come true. And now, I am Brandon, 42 years old. Up until that afternoon, I thought I was providing a decent life for my family. We were at the town's charity marathon. I had just finished my run and walked behind the organizers' tents to grab a bottle of water. That's when I heard my 16-year-old son's voice on the other side of the canvas. He wasn't talking to his friends. He was talking to a wealthy neighbor of ours, a man known for flashing his money around. My son was complaining. He mocked the rusted doors of my old pickup truck, whining about how embarrassing it was to be seen in it. Then he dropped the sentence that completely severed our bond. "I wish that useless old man wasn't my father," he said, his voice dripping with resentment. "I wish you were my dad instead. At least you know how to succeed." I waited for the adult in the conversation to correct him. Instead, the rich neighbor just chuckled a dry and arrogant sound. "Well, kid ambition matters," he replied. I stood frozen behind the tent. I didn't storm over. I didn't yell. The anger never came. It was instantly replaced by a cold, suffocating exhaustion. In that single moment, the boy I raised became a complete stranger. I quietly turned around and walked away, taking his cruel wish as a final demand. If you want to see exactly how a father teaches his ungrateful son the ultimate lesson about respect and consequences, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this story ends. The ride home that day sank into a suffocating silence, and dinner was reduced to the sharp, piercing clatter of silverware against porcelain. I didn't yell, nor did I flip the table in a fit of rage. True betrayal doesn't make you loud. It makes you incredibly quiet. I spent that sleepless night dismantling the father I used to be and constructing the exact man my son had asked for. The next morning was Lincoln's 16th birthday. He walked into the kitchen with a smug smirk, clearly expecting a set of shiny car keys to be sitting next to his pancakes. When he found nothing, the smirk vanished. He crossed his arms and demanded to know when we were going to the dealership to pick out his new ride. I set my coffee mug down and looked at him, not as a parent looking at a child, but as a landlord looking at a demanding tenant. "We aren't going anywhere," I said. My tone completely devoid of the warmth he was accustomed to. "This house provides you with 3 meals a day, a warm bed, and running water. That is the legal extent of my obligation. If you want the luxury of a vehicle, you will need to fill out job applications, work late shifts after school, and pay for the car, the maintenance, the gas, and the expensive insurance entirely by yourself." He stared at me, his jaw slacking in absolute disbelief. Then came the familiar eye roll followed by a loud scoff. He muttered something under his breath about me being pathetic and cheap, clearly convinced this was just a temporary tantrum on my part. He assumed the bank of Dad would eventually reopen if he just acted sufficiently annoyed. It didn't. Over the following weeks, I methodically severed every financial and emotional privilege he had blindly taken for granted. I immediately canceled the secondary credit card he used for frivolous mall runs. The stream of designer clothes dried up overnight. Whenever he asked for cash, my answer was a flat, unapologetic no. I stopped asking about his day and stopped offering advice. More importantly, I stopped showing up. When the high school basketball season started, my regular seat in the bleachers remained empty. My wife Judy immediately noticed the freezing temperature settling over our home. She would corner me, her eyes full of confusion, asking why I was suddenly treating our boy like a burdensome stranger. I deflected her questions, offering vague excuses about work stress. I couldn't bring myself to break her heart by telling her the sickening truth. Lincoln noticed my absence, but his overwhelming pride wouldn't let him ask why. Instead, his attitude grew increasingly insolent. He treated our home exactly like a cheap motel. Whenever we crossed paths, our exchanges were strictly transactional. Pass the salt. Move your shoes. There was no warmth, no guidance, no affection left to give. I had effectively resigned from the role he despised. He had wished for a different father, so I stepped down, leaving him with a silent landlord. 2 grueling years passed, and the invisible chasm between us was finally filled by college acceptance letters scattered across the coffee table. Lincoln had just turned 18. Among the pile of glossy brochures, he had selected an extraordinarily expensive private university out of state, a place far beyond our family's practical means. One Tuesday evening, he didn't ask for a conversation. He simply marched into the living room and threw a thick stack of student loan documents directly onto my lap. He tossed a blue pen on top of the papers, crossing his arms with an expectant, entitled posture. He needed a co-signer to secure the massive funds, and he fully assumed I would blindly attach my name, my credit score, and my financial future to his ambitions. He stood there, tapping his foot, waiting for my compliance, as if I were nothing more than a bank teller. I calmly slid the unread documents back toward him. I reminded him that legally my financial obligations ended the moment he became an adult. I was not going to jeopardize my retirement to fund a luxury education. The air in the room instantly thickened. His face flushed with a dark, boiling rage. He couldn't fathom that the bank of Dad was permanently closed. Staring down at me, his lip curled into a sneer as he let his deeply ingrained arrogance slip out into the open. "You've never been the kind of man who could afford real success anyway." He spat, his voice laced with pure contempt. I didn't flinch. I simply looked him dead in the eyes, holding his furious gaze with absolute freezing detachment. "Then you won't need my signature," I replied. My tone was flat, completely devoid of anger or sorrow. I stood up, walked past him, and headed toward the kitchen, leaving him standing alone. The reality of my words hit him like a physical blow. The illusion of my unconditional financial safety net shattered right then and there. His hands trembled slightly as he snatched the unsigned papers back, realizing for the first time that his words had permanent consequences. Forced to navigate the brutal reality of higher education alone, he had to take out exorbitant loans under his own name. But his manipulation didn't stop. It merely shifted targets. Unable to extract thousands from me, he aggressively played the role of the neglected, victimized son. He would deliberately wait until I was out of the room to corner my wife, Judy, guilt-tripping her into handing over her personal savings for his dorm supplies, textbooks, and weekend trips. Judy, always trying to keep the peace, would quietly slip him cash, hoping it would somehow fix the underlying brokenness. He also targeted my 14-year-old daughter, Clara. I would often catch him sweet-talking his younger sister, manipulating her into giving up her modest babysitting allowance to cover his late-night pizza deliveries. Clara, innocent and desperate for her older brother's approval, easily fell into his trap. He drained their empathy and their wallets, methodically siphoning small amounts of money while treating me like a ghost. He packed his bags in bitter silence, leaving behind a fractured household as he prepared to step into his so-called successful future. The suffocating atmosphere in the house faded when he packed his suitcases and moved into the dorms, leaving a timeline that drifted for 6 long years until an unexpected phone call. Lincoln was now 24 years old. He had managed to graduate and land a job, but his sense of entitlement had only grown with age. When my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, I didn't expect a heartfelt update. Instead, his voice came through the speaker with a cold, demanding familiarity. He informed me that he was officially engaged to a woman named Vanessa, whom he described more like a trophy than a partner. Without even asking how his mother or I were doing, he dove straight into his real agenda. "Dad, I'm sending you the invoice for the engagement dinner. he said, as if he were discussing a business transaction. It's tradition. The father handles the expenses for the celebration. It's expected. I leaned against the counter, my expression unreadable. Tradition requires respect. Lincoln, I replied calmly. You haven't spoken to me in months, and now you're calling with a bill. I could almost hear the arrogant smirk on the other end of the line. He let out a dismissive, airy chuckle that grated on my nerves. Relax, it's just money. You've always been so tight with it. Just do this one thing for your son's future, so I don't look bad in front of Vanessa's family. The dinner was held at an obscenely expensive French restaurant downtown, a place where the waiters wore white gloves, and the wine list cost more than my first truck. When Judy, Clara, and I arrived, the snub was immediate and calculated. Lincoln had meticulously arranged the seating chart to send a clear message. He placed Judy and our 20-year-old daughter, Clara, at a cramped table in the far corner near the kitchen doors, where the air was hot and noisy. I was seated right beside them, hidden behind a large decorative pillar that blocked any view of the main stage. Meanwhile, the head table, the table of honor, was reserved for Lincoln, Vanessa, her wealthy parents, and Victor. Our old neighbor sat there in a tailored suit, grinning like a shark, while Lincoln toasted him repeatedly. Throughout the night, my son stood up and loudly praised Victor's visionary mentorship and unwavering support, credit that rightfully belonged to the father he was currently hiding in the shadows. He paraded Victor around the room, introducing him to Vanessa's parents as his true guiding light, and the man who taught him what real success looked like. I sat in that dark corner, watching the boy I had clothed and fed for 18 years perform a grotesque theater of betrayal. I caught Clara's eyes. She looked hurt, her small hands clutching her napkin, as she watched her brother worship a stranger. Judy looked down at her plate, her silence heavy with a grief she could no longer hide. Lincoln didn't glance toward our table once. He was too busy playing the part of the high society son, assuming that the useless old man in the corner would quietly foot the $35,000 bill for a party he wasn't even invited to enjoy. My patience, preserved through years of silent observation, finally reached its absolute end. The sharp, piercing clatter of a spoon against a crystal glass cut through the melodic background music, and the restaurant's opulent chandeliers cast a shimmering light over Lincoln's smug, self-satisfied face. He stood up at the head table, clutching a wireless microphone with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He began a long, glowing speech, but it wasn't for the family who had raised him. He looked directly at Victor, his eyes shining with a desperate kind of adoration. He called the man his true north, the only person who had ever shown him what real power and success looked like. He told the room that without Victor's visionary mentorship, he would have remained stuck in the mediocrity of his upbringing. Vanessa's parents nodded in approval, and Victor basked in the attention, wearing a grin that made my skin crawl. Then Lincoln's gaze shifted to the dark corner where we sat. His smile turned into something sharper, something far more cruel. He pointed the microphone toward me, ensuring every wealthy guest and future in-law was watching. And now, he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. I'd like to invite my father to stand up. He's been a bit quiet tonight, but I know he's eager to say a few words, and more importantly, take care of the $35,000 bill for this incredible celebration. It's the least he can do for a son who has finally made something of himself. A heavy silence fell over the room. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and calm. I didn't look at the manager who was already approaching with the leather-bound invoice. I walked toward the center of the room and took the microphone from Lincoln's trembling hand. He expected a humble speech. He expected me to play the role of the proud, submissive father. Instead, I looked him dead in the eye and spoke clearly so that every person in that restaurant could hear the truth. 8 years ago, I began my voice steady and cold. I heard you tell this man beside you that you wished this useless old man wasn't your father. You said you wished he was your dad instead. You wanted a different life, a different family, and a different man to pay your way. I paused, letting the shock ripple through the crowd. I took those words to heart, Lincoln. I adjusted my will and my responsibilities years ago. You stopped being my obligation the moment you wished I didn't exist. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I reached into my pocket, but I didn't pull out a credit card. I pulled out a small folded piece of paper, the original quote for the dinner he had sent me. I placed the microphone back on the table. Since you spent the entire night claiming Victor is the man who truly raised you, I think it's only fair that he handles the tradition of the bill. I am not paying a single cent for this theater of betrayal. I looked at Judy and Clara, who were already standing, their faces pale but resolute. Enjoy your evening, Lincoln, I said softly. I turned my back on the entire room, leaving the $35,000 invoice sitting untouched on the table of honor as I walked out into the cool night air. The silence fell onto the red velvet carpet of the banquet hall, heavy enough that I could clearly hear the frantic, shallow breathing of the future in-laws. For a few agonizing seconds, no one moved. Lincoln stood frozen, his hand still shaped, as if he were holding the microphone I had just discarded his face, a ghostly mask of shock and burgeoning panic. I didn't stay to watch him crumble, but the echoes of what followed reached me before I even hit the exit. Victor, the man my son had spent years idolizing, was the first to break the tension. There was no grand gesture of support, no protective arm thrown around Lincoln's shoulder. Instead, I heard the clinical dry sound of Victor standing up and buttoning his expensive suit jacket. His voice carried across the hushed room, stripped of all the warmth he had displayed only minutes prior. I thought this matter had been handled, he remarked with a chilling indifference. Without a second glance at the boy who had just worshipped him, Victor turned and walked toward the door, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He had no interest in being a father to someone who came with a $35,000 debt. The rejection from the in-laws was even swifter. Vanessa didn't scream or cause a scene. Her reaction was far more devastating. She looked at Lincoln not with love, but with a visceral, cold disgust that made him look small. "You lied to my family," she whispered, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "You built this entire life on a foundation of stolen money and fake status." She didn't wait for his stuttered explanation. She grabbed her clutch, signaled to her stunned parents, and they marched out of the hall in a phalanx of silent fury. In less than 5 minutes, the high society world Lincoln had painstakingly constructed had evaporated. Inside the car, the atmosphere was different than any we had shared before. Judy sat in the passenger seat, her head bowed as she finally connected the dots of the last 8 years. She didn't ask me why I did it. She didn't defend him. I could hear her quiet, muffled sobs, but they weren't tears of anger toward me. They were tears of profound grief for the husband she had watched suffer in silence. Clara sat in the back, her hand resting on my shoulder, in a silent show of solidarity. Behind us, through the grand glass windows of the restaurant, I could see the lonely figure of my son. He was slumped in his chair, surrounded by half-eaten gourmet food and expensive flower arrangements, as the manager stood over him with the leather-bound invoice. He was finally getting exactly what he wanted, a life where I was no longer his father. Only now he was realizing the true cost of that wish. The darkness of the parking lot swallowed the gaudy, colorful lights of the restaurant, leaving only the sound of his frantic, desperate footsteps chasing after my back. Lincoln caught up to me just as I reached the driver's side door, his expensive tuxedo jacket disheveled and his face twisted in a mask of pure terror. He reached out to grab my arm, but I stepped back, letting his hand fall into the empty night air. "Dad, please," he gasped, his voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard before. "You can't just leave me there. That manager is threatening to call the police. Vanessa's father said he's calling his lawyers. I don't have that kind of money. You know? I don't." When I didn't respond, he stepped closer, his eyes darting around the vacant lot. "Fine, I'll fix this. I'll apologize to Vanessa, but I need to move back into my old room for a while, just until I get back on my feet and handle the debt. Please just pay this one last thing and let me come home." I opened the car door and sat behind the wheel, looking up at him, with a detachment so profound it seemed to finally pierce through his ego. I didn't see the son I used to adore. I saw the man he had chosen to become a man who valued shadows over substance. "You're an adult now, Lincoln," I said, my voice as steady as the engine as I turned the key. "And adults don't dep their messes by moving back in with the parents they despise. You spent years wishing I wasn't your father. Tonight, I finally granted you that wish." I pulled the door shut, the heavy thud echoing like a final gavel strike. As I shifted into gear and began to drive away, I saw him in the rearview mirror, standing solitary under a flickering streetlight, a small, broken figure, holding a debt he couldn't pay. Months have passed since that night. The quiet in our home is no longer heavy. It is peaceful. On a Saturday afternoon, I find myself in the garage, slowly wiping down the hood of my old pickup truck. The rusted doors still creak, but the engine runs smoother than ever. Clara walks out with a fresh bucket of soapy water, smiling as she helps me scrub the chrome. Judy joins us a moment later, resting her hand gently on my shoulder as we watch the sunset paint the driveway in hues of gold. There are no frantic phone calls, no manipulative demands, and no forced forgiveness. We have simply moved forward, leaving the ghosts of ungrateful wishes behind in the rearview mirror of a life reclaimed.